Yeah.
So, hello, this is Andrew, the chaplain at St. John's, continuing our series that we're calling What Really Matters. And we're speaking to an amazing, diverse array of folk. And today we're actually speaking, or I'm speaking, to a Jonian. Here is Tim Unwin. Now, I've had to arm myself with his biography because it is so extensive. And it begins UNESCO Chair in ICT 4D, Emeritus Professor of Geography at Royal Holloway, University of London, and an amazing array of things. It would be very easy, Tim, and thank you very much for agreeing to do this. It'd be very easy to look at this and say, goodness me, what's driving him? And it might be that rather than the question, what really matters to you, it's say what's driving you in all this great sequence of activities. Is that if that's not too rude a question, what does that provoke you to say?
That it's a question I often asked, actually, and I've been giving some thought to it in recent years, because it's a bit frightening that sort of somebody in their mid-60s who had a wonderful time as a student at John's is still so driven. And people say, Tim, what makes you sort of still have the passion for the things you do? And so I've been thinking about that in the recent few years, and I think there are probably sort of three main areas that have been important for me. The one is the notion that, to whom much is given, much is expected, and I can say a lot more about that. The other is around I've been very fortunate, privileged indeed, to lead a number of organizations, and my leadership style has very much changed, but has evolved into understanding that to lead an organization successfully, you have to have a notion of servant leadership. And then I guess the third thing is around a notion I came up with a few years back called serendipitous rigor. In the sense, you've got to be rigorous in enabling serendipity to happen. But once serendipity has happened, you then need to be rigorous in implementing it. So I could say, if we think about to whom much is given, much is expected. I had an extraordinary time as an undergraduate and benefited amazingly. I think anyone who was in Cambridge in the early 70s in the social sciences had to be suffused with a fair dose of Marxist theory. But I sort of took that a little bit further, actually, and got into thinking about and work with and on critical theory, the work of Jürgen Habermas, which was about theory and practice, bringing the two together. And that's always been really important for me. I don't think academics should remain academics for always. One of the things I did in the early 2000s, I went to work in the Department for International Development. And I've been working for 20 years on development. And I think in 6 months at DFID, I learned more about the practice of development than everything I'd done previously. But I'd also at John's met an incredible Indian scholar. He was a sort of professor in India himself, but was doing his PhD. And he said, just as I was starting my own PhD, which was on medieval settlement and society, Tim, why don't you come with me to India and be my research assistant? And the work he was doing in what was then South Bihar, Jharkhand now, on rural markets. And I learned so much for him at different levels, but one of the most important lessons was that development has to be about reducing inequalities and not just as economic growth. And then you combine that with sort of a Marxist tradition. That is one driver. And here I was a rich young white guy, well, relatively rich, and seeing the immense inequalities that existed there. And I think I've then had opportunities to explore that further, and wherever I've gone, it's been, wow, here am I with all the things that I have, even coming back from field work and practical development interventions in other parts of the world, and coming back to the community that I live in, and just realizing, I've got this. I have to do something about that for those our brothers and sisters across the world. Who
I can imagine this, not to use too much of a jargon, but triangulating somewhat with your faith. So use your own work in the medieval world, which presumably was incredibly unequal, both in terms of power and resources, and then the modern period in India, where you could see a different version of that, and then and it's whatever the four version of triangulate is. You've been getting interested in this kind of Marxist critique of all of this, and your own Christian faith, which, I mean, one can just hear from immediately the way you use language that is something which is fundamental to your life as well.
It's very much driven by my faith, and yeah, Luke 12. But I think that was sort of, I'm not sure how conscious that was in the early days. I think the more I've reflected, the more I keep coming back to reading the Bible, the more that has infused me. But you touched on that comparison. There's one of my earliest papers, I still quite enjoy it, was actually drawing a comparison between medieval marketing systems and the existing today marketing systems in rural Jharkhand. But I think faith probably comes through almost more in the idea of servant leadership.
Yeah.
I was the head of a very successful geography department in the late 90s. And I made the big mistake of wanting to be liked by everybody. A tip for a leader: you can never be liked by everybody. And gradually over time, I then sort of came to realize that leadership, I think particularly today, but perhaps always in the past, is about serving others. And those others can be your team. It can be the others for the organization you're leading. And two examples, I had, amazing, serendipitous, but was asked to lead one of the then Prime Minister's initiatives on partnerships for education using IT in Africa. And I had an amazing team from whom I learned a lot. But a colleague said to me, even when you're doing something, Tim, and it is yours, never say I, always say we. And that includes your team. It reflects benefit and positiveness to your team. It involves them. And then I had, when I led the Commonwealth Telecommunications Organization, that was just an incredible experience. But the organization as a whole, if it had any rationale to it, was to serve the 53, as it was then, countries of the Commonwealth, and helping those governments develop more coherent digital technology policies and practices, regulation that would be of benefit to all, and that was important. And I think another aspect of that is around, so much development is done on or for others, and a lesson I've learned again over the last 20 years around this idea of servant leadership is that we as academics or politicians or people in the companies, perhaps less so those in the private sector, but we should be the servants of the poorest and the most marginalized. They should be determining our research agendas. We shouldn't be concocting them. And then one of the reasons why much of the interventions, many of the interventions around technology and development fail, is because they're sort of designed in a laboratory in a great university or in a company R&D department, maybe then piloted with a particular group of intended, the target population. Again, terrible work, and they invariably fail. If you can work with and in the interests of and serving the real needs of some of the poorest and most marginalized, then you can begin, I think, to make changes and things that will be much more sustainable. And it's bringing all of that together. And there's now quite a literature around servant leadership. But again, I think for all Christians, we're encouraged to serve others. And there are so many bits of the Bible that talk about that. Obviously the Samaritan, but I think we do need to have a much greater shift to necessarily the male top-down leader, to different ways in which we can actually deliver something worthwhile.
This whole idea of leadership, or just the language of leadership, is, I mean, certainly in a church context, is something that does tax me occasionally, because it just seems, until you stick servant in front of it, it sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it, to a kind of a certain sort of humility. And I guess the real challenge is when you talk about servant leadership, do you need the word leadership at all? Or is it just that it's a handy word because it's describing that you're in a role where you've got responsibility for a project or a group of people? Is it a risk of, because I just worry that it's at risk of being a slightly toxic word, both in the Christian context, but more widely. You know, whenever my sister has worked in schools of a certain kind where they're good schools, and the children there are encouraged to think it's not just that they're being educated to be the best that they can be, but they're going to sort of lead in the world. And there is this notion that good education and getting on in life is about, in the end, it sounds like just being in charge of things, in charge of people.
But I agree with that. I mean, I think, just touch on what you were saying earlier, I think a real challenge is about humility and false humility, and one can get tied up in if one gets too concerned about that, one can tie oneself in knots. But I do think, whether we like it or not, there are people who lead in the world. People are encouraged to move into leadership positions. In some ways, and that comes back to serendipitous rigor, I have never gone out of my way to lead, but it happens. And in that position, it's terribly easy to make the mistakes I made as a young head of department, which was, I wanted to lead, I wanted to do it this way. And I think leadership is about, you could take the shepherd notion that the shepherd is a leader of the sheep, but they need to go in a direction. And so I do think one can talk realistically about servant and leadership together, that it's not the top-down dominating leadership imposing your ideas on others. It's building the best in your team. And there's top-down leaders want to appoint everyone like themselves. I think we have to recognize the richness and the diversity. Having a team of people who are very different from you are, and helping them all, leading them to a common purpose. And yes, you need vision and a belief that it's possible to get there. But so I wouldn't always separate them as you suggested.
And when it comes to doing projects in the developing world, I mean, it's too easy to think of, coming down from the heights of Olympus, the West, to cast a little light into these benighted lives. Say a little bit about, how tech and telecommunications became, in a way, the vehicle for your involvement in that kind of work.
Well, I think I was programming in Fortran in the 70s. I remember the computer lab in Cambridge where I began putting the punch cards through. So I'd always had that technical aspect. I had other interests as well. But then it's difficult for many people, and lots of young people weren't even born then. But in the late 90s, there was the euphoria around the new millennium. It was actually going to be a better world we were creating. And look what a mess we've made of it since. And that was just the time of the tech bubble. And I've been working on tech in education in my own practice and for a long time. But it was very clear in the early 2000s that there were people who wanted to try and do development in different ways through technology, and almost that gosh, we're changing education in our Western societies. Surely, we could do that for other parts of the world. And that horrible term, sort of bridging the digital divide, because actually digital tech is increasing the divide, so you can never bridge it, came about. And I still hold on to the belief that is possible. But over the last 20 years, more of a realization that digital tech is increasing inequalities rather than reducing them. And so all our work really has been around mitigating the harms to enable the benefits to take place.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's a very different thing from, tech being a version of don't give people fish, teach them how to fish. That in fact it's much more complicated, and there is all sorts of power dynamics at work and all of that, presumably.
You and I are but data. Having a video call is using a huge amount of electricity. If we weren't, it's lovely to see your face and speak like this. But if we just had the images, we would save a huge amount of bandwidth and thus electricity. Bitcoin alone uses more energy than the whole of, I think, Argentina it is now. So this tech is problematic. But another answer to your question is this notion of serendipitous rigor.
Yeah.
You have to be rigorous in enabling serendipity to happen. And I think being willing to from move to a head department to leading one of the Prime Minister's special initiatives was an amazing opportunity, which just happened. But then being really rigorous in how you apply,
how you do it. Yeah.
And so when in 2011 I decided I wanted to change. I was going to teach overseas in China and India and do research there. And then I was asked, why not apply for this other job? And I got it, and amazing experiences, opportunities to do things. So I think all too often we get constrained within our own frameworks and our own trajectories. I've never been somebody who's planned his career. Maybe I should have done so, but it's taking opportunities, making the most of them, and sitting here in the UK, we are so privileged, and yes, there's immense inequality here as well, but it's incumbent on us to do something about it. I mean, take the vaccine and look at how China is now actually creating huge amounts of vaccine, which it is able and hopefully will be giving. We're not going to solve COVID-19 here in the UK unless it's solved more widely, for example. And it's working with rather than too many people say they're doing research on or they're doing something for. I want to change that vocabulary so that we're serving others. And imagine the people who determine your research being people living in a village without electricity or technology. How can technology help them? Living with them, understanding what they want, and then helping them develop solutions.
That's very good. I love that. And so we're going to take away servant leadership and serendipitous rigor. I love that phrase. That's brilliant. And
to whom much is given, much is expected.
Absolutely, yes, and too right. It may seem an odd comparison, but one of my favorite saints, one of my go-to saints, is St. Vincent de Paul. Why should a 16th century French saintly priest, but somebody who managed to be the most extraordinary leader of, in the end, vast armies of brothers and sisters, monks and nuns, looking after the poor. And his number one line was, "The poor are our masters," as he put it. "Les pauvres sont nos maîtres." And he managed to combine this extraordinary capacity to run things and get resources and just empty himself the whole time, but live to an enormous age by just thinking, what do people need? And in a way that wasn't just handing over charity, but was enabling them to clamber out of where they were.
And the driver is, there's so much still to be done. I mean, I think let's go on and do it. But Saint Vincent was also the patron saint of vignerons and winemakers. But maybe it's
I think we leave that thought dangling, that wine is another strand of enthusiasm in your amazing, sort of Byzantinely complicated but exciting life. Thank you so much, Tim. This has been really brilliant. And best wishes from the Johns of now to the Jonian sitting there on one half of my screen.
It's been so nice to get to know you a bit through this, and obviously a new generation of Jonians, and wishing them the very best.
It's been tough times, but we're getting through it. Thank you very much. Take care. God bless.
And you.